The transatlantic slave trade is one of the darkest chapters in human history. Millions of Africans were torn from their homeland, separated from their families, and transported under inhumane conditions to an unknown fate. Picture yourself aboard one of these ships. The air is thick with the stench of fear and despair. The cries and moans of the enslaved, crammed into tight spaces, echo against the ship's walls. Each wave crashing against the hull serves as a stark reminder of their fragile existence. These ships weren't just means of transport. They were silent witnesses to unimaginable suffering. But what happened to the ships that undertook this horrific journey? Some were lost to the depths of the ocean, while others were captured or abandoned. Each of these ships has a unique story, filled with mystery and tragedy. Let's uncover these secrets and understand the impact these vessels had on history. Imagine stumbling upon an abandoned ship, silently drifting in the middle of the ocean. The masts sway in the wind, the sails are tattered, and an eerie silence reigns on board. What happened to the crew? Where did the enslaved people go? These questions intrigue and challenge our understanding. Today's video will take you on a journey filled with suspense and revelations. From ships captured by abolitionist patrols to those that vanished without a trace, each story is a piece of the puzzle that forms the tragic fate of these vessels. The transatlantic slave trade began in the 15th century when Portuguese explorers started capturing and transporting Africans to work in colonies in the Americas. This trade grew exponentially in the following centuries, driven by the demand for cheap labor to fuel the expansion of sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations. Slave ships became the backbone of this operation, specifically designed to maximize human cargo capacity, often at the expense of the captives' dignity and lives. The main countries involved in the slave trade included Portugal, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands. Each nation developed specific maritime routes, connecting African ports to slave markets in the Caribbean, Brazil, and North America. These ships undertook long and perilous journeys, facing storms, pirates, and the constant threat of onboard rebellions. Despite the risks, the trade was highly profitable, encouraging the continuation of this brutal practice. The slave routes, known as the triangular trade, involved three main stages: the departure of ships from Europe carrying goods to Africa, the exchange of these goods for African slaves, and the Atlantic crossing, known as the Middle Passage, to the Americas. The ships then returned to Europe, loaded with colonial products, completing the triangle. This economic system was sustained by the suffering and exploitation of millions of Africans. The impact of this trade was devastating. African societies were dismantled, with entire communities being captured and sold. The slaves faced a horrific journey, crammed into tight quarters below deck, with inadequate access to food, water, or fresh air. Many did not survive the voyage. Those who reached their destinations were forced to work under extremely harsh conditions, with little hope of freedom or better treatment. The slave trade left an indelible mark on history and the collective memory of humanity. For the captured slaves, the experience aboard the slave ships was an indescribable nightmare. After being torn from their lands and families, they were marched to the coast in forced marches, where they waited in forts or barracks for the arrival of the ships. Boarding the ship marked the beginning of a new horror. Chained to one another, men, women, and children were packed into tiny spaces, with no room to move or find comfort. The conditions in the ship holds were inhumane. Slaves were kept in cramped decks with no proper ventilation, making the environment suffocating and unsanitary. Food and water were scarce and of poor quality, often contaminated. Diseases spread rapidly, causing fevers, dysentery, and other illnesses that claimed many lives before reaching their destination. The air was filled with cries of pain, sobbing, and the stench of death. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was a test of physical and mental endurance. Besides disease and hunger, the slaves faced brutal treatment from the crew. Physical punishment, torture, and abuse were common, used to maintain control and prevent uprisings. Even under such extreme conditions, there were attempts at rebellion. Some slaves chose death, throwing themselves overboard, rather than continue living in such misery. For those who survived the crossing, arrival in the New World did not mark the end of suffering, but the beginning of a new form of slavery. Sold in markets like commodities, they were destined for plantations, mines, and other forms of forced labor. Separated from their families and identities, the slaves had to find ways to resist and preserve their cultures and dignity. Their stories are testimonies of resistance and survival in the face of extreme oppression. The seas that slave ships crossed were treacherous, full of natural and human dangers. Many ships never reached their destination, succumbing to violent storms, treacherous reefs, or pirate attacks. Each shipwreck represented a tragedy of immense proportions, with the loss of hundreds of human lives whose stories and dreams were tragically cut short. Accounts of slave shipwrecks are numerous and often involve scenes of unimaginable horror. In some instances, adverse weather conditions caused ships to be swallowed by waves, dragging everyone on board to the ocean floor. In other cases, ships ran aground on reefs or sandbanks, and the crews and slaves, trapped on board, faced a slow and agonizing death while waiting for a rescue that never came. There are also legends and stories about lost ships that still haunt the seas. These tales speak of ghost ships, seen drifting aimlessly with tattered sails and skeletal crews. While many of these accounts are products of imagination and folklore, they reflect the fear and mystery surrounding these voyages. Some of these ghost ships have become cultural icons, symbolizing the tragedy and suffering of the slaves they carried. The ships lost at sea left behind scant physical evidence. However, in recent years, marine archaeologists have made fascinating discoveries, uncovering the wrecks of slave ships that shed light on these forgotten tragedies. These findings are crucial for a comprehensive understanding of the slave trade and for honoring the memory of the lives lost. Each discovery serves as a silent reminder of the cruelty of the past and the importance of remembering and honoring these stories. With the rise of the abolitionist movement in the 19th century, several nations began patrolling the oceans in search of slave ships. These naval patrols, composed of warships, were tasked with intercepting and capturing vessels involved in the slave trade. Seizing these ships not only halted the continuation of the trade, but also saved the lives of many slaves facing the perilous crossing. When a slave ship was captured, the scenes on board were often harrowing. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of slaves were found chained and in deplorable conditions. Many were on the brink of death due to starvation, disease, or mistreatment. The patrols would rescue these slaves, providing them with medical care and temporary shelter. However, liberation did not automatically mean full freedom, as many freed slaves faced an uncertain future. One of the most shocking and revealing stories about slave ships is that of the Zong. In 1781, this British ship was transporting 442 slaves from West Africa to Jamaica. During the voyage, due to overcrowding and unsanitary conditions, an epidemic began to spread among the slaves and the crew. To avoid losing the value of his investment, Captain Luke Collingwood made a horrifying decision. He ordered more than 130 slaves to be thrown overboard, claiming that this would allow him to claim insurance for the lost goods. Captain Collingwood's decision was driven by greed. He knew that if the slaves died of natural causes, the ship's owners would not receive compensation. However, if the slaves were thrown overboard out of necessity to save the ship, the insurers would pay for the loss. This monstrous decision resulted in the deaths of approximately 133 slaves, whose bodies were cast into the sea to reduce the financial losses of the ship's owners. The story of the Zong is a grim reminder of the brutality of the slave trade and the cruelty of those who profited from it. Today, the case is often cited as an example of the inherent inhumanity of slavery and the corrosive impact of unchecked capitalism. The memory of the slaves thrown overboard by the Zong continues to inspire movements for justice and reparations, serving as a powerful symbol of resistance against oppression. The Clotilda, known as the last slave ship to transport slaves to the United States, has an equally fascinating and tragic story. In 1860, nearly 50 years after the slave trade was declared illegal in the U.S., the Clotilda made a clandestine voyage from West Africa to Alabama, carrying 110 Africans. This act of defiance against the law was driven by the desire to get rich quickly, ignoring the prohibitions and risks involved. To avoid detection, Captain William Foster burned and sank the Clotilda after disembarking the slaves, attempting to destroy the evidence of his crime. The trafficked Africans were sold and distributed among various owners in the region. However, the story of the Clotilda and its captives was not forgotten. The descendants of these slaves, known as Clotildians, kept the memory of their ancestors and their origins alive. In 2019, the wreck of the Clotilda was finally discovered in the Mobile River, Alabama. This historic discovery shed new light on the final chapter of the U.S. slave trade. Archaeologists and historians worked together to preserve the wreck and study the remains of the ship, providing a tangible connection to the past and helping to tell the story of the Africans who survived the crossing. As we uncover more about these ships and the lives they carried, we are constantly reminded of humanity's capacity for cruelty, but also for compassion and justice. Each story of a slave ship challenges us to acknowledge the injustices of the past and to work towards a future where such atrocities never happen again. The memory of these events must be preserved to educate and inspire future generations. Now that you know more about the tragic fate of slave ships, leave your comments below and share your thoughts. If you found this video informative, please give it a like and share it with your friends and family. Don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating stories. If you liked this video, check out the one on the screen about the life of the last slave in South Carolina. You can't miss it. See you next time.